Ellie Westbrook smoothed the wrinkles from her simple blue dress as the morning sun warmed her face. The wooden bleachers at the Naval Special Warfare Training Center in Coronado were already filling with proud families clutching cameras and flowers. She had arrived early to get a good seat, positioning herself where she could clearly see the graduation platform. Today, her son Jimmy would graduate from the grueling 6-month SEAL training program. At 58, Ellie looked like any other proud mother, her graying brown hair neatly pinned back, sensible shoes on her feet, and a small American flag pin on her collar. The young families around her chatted excitedly, their conversations filled with civilian questions about what SEAL life would be like. "Is this your first time on a military base?" asked a friendly woman who took the seat beside her. Ellie smiled politely. "No, I've been on a few before. My son says only 30% of the class made it through. Can you believe how tough these boys are?" The woman continued without waiting for an answer. "I'm Linda, by the way. My son is Mike Carson." "Eleanor Westbrook, my son is Jimmy." Ellie shook the woman's hand, her grip firmer than Linda expected. "Oh, Jimmy Westbrook? Mike has mentioned him, said he was one of the strongest in the water. Is his father here too?" Ellie's smile tightened slightly. "No, Robert passed away 10 years ago, Army Ranger, Afghanistan." "Oh, I'm so sorry." Linda touched her arm sympathetically. "A military family, then? That explains where Jimmy got his toughness." If only you knew, Ellie thought, but simply nodded. The truth was far more complicated than she could explain to this well-meaning stranger. As the grandstands filled around her, Ellie's mind drifted back 35 years, to another military ceremony where she had stood at attention rather than sat in the audience. Naval Intelligence Officer Lieutenant Eleanor Hayes had been one of only 12 women selected for a classified program in 1988, a program the public still knew very little about. Before special operations were officially open to women, a small unit of female intelligence officers had been trained for specific covert missions where men couldn't operate without detection. They were called the Athena Unit, though officially they didn't exist. "Would you like some water, ma'am?" A young sailor offered her a bottle, pulling her from her memories. "Thank you." Ellie took it gratefully. The California sun was getting warmer as the morning progressed. She unscrewed the cap, her fingers tracing over a small scar on her right hand, a souvenir from Beirut, 1989. More families arrived, the stands growing crowded with excited parents, siblings, and spouses. Ellie observed them with the quiet assessment habits she had never fully abandoned. 3 decades in intelligence had made observation second nature. She noticed things others didn't: the sailor with the slightly off-regulation haircut, the way the security personnel scanned the crowd, the almost imperceptible earpieces worn by plainclothes personnel. "They're doing a good job with security," she commented absently to Linda. "Are they?" Linda looked around, confused. "I don't see much security except for those few guards." Ellie just smiled. "That's the point." Checking her watch, she saw there was still an hour before the ceremony. Her thoughts returned to Jimmy. He hadn't wanted her to come alone, had offered to fly his sister Sarah down from Seattle to accompany her. "I'm perfectly capable of traveling by myself," she had told him during their last phone call. "I've been to 54 countries, many of them alone and under far more dangerous circumstances than a commercial flight to San Diego." Jimmy had laughed. "Mom, most of the other parents don't know that their son's mother used to." "That's classified, Jimmy," she'd interrupted, though she was smiling. Even her children knew only portions of her service record. Some parts would remain redacted forever. A commotion near the parade ground drew Ellie's attention. The graduating class was gathering for a pre-ceremony inspection. Her heart swelled with pride as she spotted Jimmy among them, so tall and strong, looking so much like his father, but with her determined chin and observant eyes. The young men stood perfectly still as their instructors moved between them, checking every detail of their uniforms. Though she was too far away to hear, Ellie could read the instructor's body language and expressions. This was more than standard inspection. This was the final test of discipline before these young men officially became Navy SEALs. "They look so serious," Linda whispered. "They should be," Ellie replied. "What they're being entrusted with requires absolute seriousness." "Of course," Linda agreed, though her tone suggested she didn't fully understand. "Mike says they've been training for 6 months straight." "Actually, Bud S is just the beginning," Ellie explained. using the acronym for Basic Underwater Demolition SEAL Training. After today, they'll go through additional specialized training before they're assigned to a team. Linda looked impressed. You know a lot about this. I try to understand what my son is going through, Ellie said simply. What she didn't say was that decades ago, she had gone through her own version of Hell Week, a training program designed to break all but the most determined candidates. While not identical to SEAL training, the Athena selection process had been specifically created to identify women who could endure extreme stress, maintain secrecy, and operate independently in hostile territory. From the original 50 candidates, only 12 had completed the program. Of those 12, only 8 had survived their service years. Ellie was one of them. "Oh, look, they're bringing out the chairs for the stage," Linda pointed, excitement building in her voice. Ellie watched as sailors arranged the platform where the ceremony would take place. Among the officers beginning to gather was a tall commander with silver hair. Something about his posture caught her attention. She narrowed her eyes, studying him. There was something familiar in the way he moved, the way he carried himself. Could it be? After all these years. The commander turned slightly, and Ellie caught a glimpse of his profile. Her breath caught. It was Marcus Sullivan, now Commander Sullivan apparently. They had worked together in the Persian Gulf during Operation Desert Storm. He had been a young SEAL lieutenant then, and she had been the intelligence officer who provided his team with critical information for 3 high-risk missions. He wouldn't recognize her, of course. During those operations, they had met only in darkened briefing rooms, her face often partially concealed as per protocol for Athena operatives. Her name on documents had simply been Intelligence Officer Hayes. Most of the men they supported never knew their full names or saw their faces clearly. That was how the program had been designed. Ellie watched Commander Sullivan direct his staff, wondering if he ever thought about the female intelligence officer who had drawn the detailed maps of Iraqi bunker systems from memory after being extracted from 3 weeks of covert observation behind enemy lines. Probably not. That was the nature of their work, invisible, unacknowledged, forgotten once the mission was complete. The crowd was growing louder as more families arrived, the excitement palpable as the ceremony time approached. Several rows behind her, Ellie overheard a conversation between 2 fathers discussing their son's training. "My boy said the worst part was the cold. Said they stood in the surf for hours until some of the men couldn't feel their legs anymore," one father said. "Mike told me about the bell," the other replied. "Said they kept it right there on the beach, and all you had to do was ring it 3 times and the suffering would stop. Said the sound of that bell was the biggest temptation he's ever faced." Ellie smiled faintly. The Athenas had a bell too. They called it the Whisper because candidates didn't even have to ring it. Just whisper, "I quit," to any instructor and they could leave. During her training, 5 women had whispered during a 48-hour underwater navigation exercise in the frigid waters off Maine. A young naval officer approached the bleachers with a clipboard, moving through the crowd checking names. "Family name?" he asked when he reached Ellie's row. "Westbrook," she answered, "for Lieutenant James Westbrook." He checked his list, then looked up with a practiced smile. "Ah, Mrs. Westbrook, we have you seated in the family section down front during the ceremony." "Thank you, but I'm fine here," Ellie replied. "I don't need special treatment." The officer looked confused, but Lieutenant Westbrook specifically requested. "I know my son means well," she interrupted gently, "but I'd prefer to stay here." After a moment's hesitation, the officer nodded and continued down the row. Linda looked at her curiously. "Why wouldn't you want to sit in the front section? I'd give anything to be closer." Ellie shrugged. "I can see fine from here, and Jimmy will know exactly where to find me afterward." The truth was more complicated. Ellie had spent her entire career avoiding attention, staying in the background, observing rather than being observed. Old habits died hard. Even now, years after her retirement from naval intelligence, she instinctively preferred positions where she could see everyone without being prominently visible herself. As the ceremony preparation continued, Ellie reached into her small purse and touched the worn challenge coin hidden in an inner pocket. It was the only tangible recognition of her service with the Athena unit, a special coin given to each of the 12 women by the admiral who had commissioned the program. One side bore the profile of the Greek goddess Athena with her owl, the other the simple inscription, "Wisdom, Courage, Shadows, 1988." No medals had ever been awarded publicly. No recognition ceremonies held. The women of Athena had served knowing their contributions would remain classified, their sacrifices unacknowledged by all but a few high-ranking officials. And now, 3 decades later, Ellie had come to watch her son graduate into a world that had changed enough to celebrate its special operators openly, while her own service remained hidden in redacted files and classified histories. The bleachers were nearly full now. A military band had assembled at the edge of the parade ground. Soon, Jimmy and his classmates would receive their tridents, the special pin that identified them as Navy SEALs, and join one of the most elite and recognized fighting forces in the world. Ellie was more proud than she could express. Yet beneath that pride was a whisper of something else, not quite regret, but a quiet acknowledgement of how different her own service had been. How she had received her own special pin in a silent, private ceremony in a windowless Pentagon room with only 5 people present to witness it. "It's starting soon," Linda said excitedly, pulling Ellie from her thoughts. "Look, there's the commanding officer." Ellie focused on the present as a senior officer took the stage. Her son's graduation day had arrived. Today wasn't about her past, it was about Jimmy's future. She straightened her shoulders and prepared to watch her son achieve what he had worked so hard for. Just another proud mother in the stands. Or so everyone thought. The pre-graduation reception was held in a large tent adjacent to the parade ground. Families mingled with instructors and base personnel, enjoying refreshments while waiting for the graduates to arrive. Ellie stood near the edge of the gathering, a glass of water in hand, observing the controlled chaos of excited families. "Mrs. Westbrook." She turned to find a young lieutenant approaching her. His crisp white uniform and earnest expression reminded her of countless junior officers she had worked with over the years. "Yes, I'm Lieutenant Chen, ma'am. Your son asked me to make sure you were comfortable and had everything you needed." Ellie smiled. "That's very thoughtful, but I'm fine, thank you. He also asked me to escort you to the VIP section for the ceremony. The graduates will be arriving in about 30 minutes. She shook her head. "Please tell Jimmy that I appreciate his concern, but I've already found a perfectly good seat in the regular section." Lieutenant Chen looked uncomfortable. "Ma'am, Lieutenant Westbrook was quite specific about making sure you were properly accommodated." "I'm sure he was," Ellie replied kindly but firmly. "My son has always been protective, but I've been taking care of myself since before he was born, and I'll continue to do so today." Before the lieutenant could respond, a deep voice called out from behind her. "Mrs. Westbrook, I'm Commander Jackson, the Bud S training officer." Ellie turned to face a stern-looking officer in his 40s. This was the man who had pushed her son to his limits for the past 6 months. "Commander," she acknowledged with a nod, "I understand you've been making my son's life difficult." A flicker of surprise crossed Jackson's face before he caught her small smile and realized she was making a joke. He relaxed slightly. "That's my job, ma'am, though I have to say your son made it more difficult than most to break him." "Westbrooks are stubborn," Ellie said. "His father was the same way." "Ah yes, Ranger Captain Robert Westbrook. Jimmy mentioned him." Commander Jackson's expression softened slightly. "He said his father inspired him to join the military." "Robert certainly played his part," Ellie agreed. "Though he never pushed Jimmy towards service. That was Jimmy's own decision." Commander Jackson studied her with professional curiosity. "Lieutenant Westbrook mentioned you served as well. Something in administration, wasn't it?" Ellie took a sip of her water, hiding a small smile. "Yes, I was in the Navy for quite some time. Administrative support." It was the cover story she had used for years, the one her children had grown up hearing when asked about their mother's job. Administrative support could mean anything from secretarial work to logistics management. It was vague enough to be believable while requiring no specific details. "Well, your son is exceptional," Jackson continued. "One of the strongest candidates I've seen in years. During Hell Week, when most men were ready to collapse, he kept encouraging the others. Said something about how his mother taught him that mental toughness beats physical pain every time." Ellie felt a surge of pride and nostalgia. She had indeed taught him that, during a camping trip when he was 12 and had sprained his ankle 3 miles from their car. She had helped him focus through the pain, teaching him breathing techniques she had learned during her own training. "Jimmy has always been observant," she said simply. Commander Jackson nodded. He also has an unusual attention to detail for tactical planning. Most new SEALs take time to develop that skill, but your son seems to have a natural ability for it. He played a lot of chess growing up, Ellie offered, though she knew Jimmy's strategic thinking had more likely come from the dinner table conversations where she had turned world events into tactical problems for her children to solve, disguised as simple family games. A commotion at the tent entrance interrupted their conversation. Several senior officers had arrived, including Commander Sullivan, whom she had noticed earlier. Ellie instinctively shifted her position to make herself less visible, another old habit from years of field work. "If you'll excuse me, Mrs. Westbrook, I need to greet the command staff," Jackson said. "It was a pleasure meeting you. Your son is a credit to your family." As he walked away, Ellie moved further along the periphery of the tent, finding a quiet spot near a display of SEAL team photographs. She studied the images of young men in training, recognizing the exhaustion and determination in their eyes, the same look she had seen in her Athena teammates decades ago. "Impressive, aren't they?" said an elderly voice beside her. Ellie turned to see an older man in a civilian suit, his chest bearing the subtle pin of a retired Navy officer. His weathered face and careful posture suggested someone who had seen his share of conflict. "Very," she agreed, "though I suspect the photographs don't capture the half of it." He chuckled. "No, ma'am, they certainly don't." He extended his hand. "Captain Thomas Reeves, retired. My grandson is graduating today." "Eleanor Westbrook," she replied, shaking his hand. "My son as well." "Which one is yours?" Reeves asked. "Jimmy Westbrook." The captain's eyebrows rose slightly. "Ah, I've heard about him from my grandson. Says he's one of the best in the class." He studied her more carefully. "Westbrook, any relation to Captain Robert Westbrook, Army Rangers?" "My late husband," Ellie confirmed. "I'm sorry for your loss," Reeves said sincerely. "I met him once during a joint operation planning session in Afghanistan. Solid officer." "Thank you, he was." Ellie felt the familiar pang that always accompanied discussions of Robert. They had met during her second deployment, when she was providing intelligence for a joint Army-Navy operation. Their marriage had been a partnership of equals, each respecting the other's service, though few people ever understood the true nature of her work. Captain Reeves glanced around the tent, then lowered his voice slightly. "You know, my grandson mentioned that Westbrook told the class his mother was some kind of intelligence specialist. Said the other fellows gave him a hard time about exaggerating." Ellie kept her expression neutral. "Young men often build up their parents' careers. I was just a naval administrator, nothing exciting." Reeves looked at her thoughtfully. "Funny thing about naval administrators, some of the most important work in the Navy happens behind desks that officially don't exist." Before Ellie could respond, Linda appeared at her elbow, excitement radiating from her. "Ellie, they're saying the graduates will arrive in 10 minutes. We should get to our seats." "Of course," Ellie nodded, turning back to Captain Reeves. "It was nice meeting you, Captain." "Likewise, Mrs. Westbrook," he replied, a knowing look in his eye that suggested he didn't quite believe her administrative cover story. As Linda led her toward the exit, they passed a group of officers that included Commander Sullivan. Ellie kept her eyes forward, but she could feel his gaze following her briefly. Had he recognized something familiar about her? After 30 years, it seemed unlikely, yet she had learned never to underestimate the memory of special operations officers. Outside, families were returning to their seats in the bleachers. The morning had warmed considerably, and Ellie was glad she had chosen a light dress. She followed Linda back to their original seats, politely declining once more when Lieutenant Chen appeared to escort her to the VIP section. "I don't understand why you won't sit up front," Linda said as they settled into their seats. "I would love to be closer." "I can see perfectly well from here," Ellie assured her, "and I've never been one for special treatment." As the bleachers filled again, Ellie noticed increased activity around the stage. Commander Sullivan was speaking intently with Commander Jackson, occasionally glancing toward the audience. At one point, Sullivan appeared to be asking a question, and Jackson pointed in the general direction of where she was sitting. A flutter of unease passed through Ellie. Had someone recognized her? She had been officially retired for 12 years, and her most significant operations had been decades ago. Most of the officers who knew of the Athena unit had themselves retired or passed away. The military band began playing, signaling the start of the ceremony. Families quieted as the base commanding officer took the stage to welcome everyone. Ellie focused on his words, pushing aside her concerns. Today was about Jimmy, not her past. Ladies and gentlemen, we are gathered here today to recognize the extraordinary accomplishment of the men who have completed one of the most demanding training programs in the United States military, the commander began. Of the 154 candidates who began this Bud-S class, only 42 stand ready to graduate today. Applause rippled through the audience. Ellie joined in, knowing intimately what that attrition rate represented, the countless hours of suffering, the physical and mental challenges that pushed human endurance to its limits. Before we welcome our graduates, I want to acknowledge the families who supported these men through their journey, the commander continued. Behind every Navy SEAL stands a family who shares in the sacrifice of service. As he spoke, Ellie noticed more activity at the side of the stage. Commander Sullivan was now engaged in conversation with an older man in a civilian suit whom she hadn't noticed before. There was something familiar about him, though she couldn't immediately place him. Then he turned slightly, and Ellie felt her heart skip a beat. Admiral William Hargrove, retired for at least 15 years now, but unmistakable. He had been the director of naval intelligence during her time with the Athena unit, one of the few people who knew the full extent of their operations. What was he doing here? Had he come for another graduate or? Her thoughts were interrupted as the commander announced the arrival of the graduating class. The audience rose to their feet as the SEAL candidates marched onto the field in perfect formation, their faces solemn and proud. Ellie spotted Jimmy immediately, fourth in the second row. Her son, now about to become one of the most elite special operators in the world. The lump in her throat had nothing to do with her earlier concerns and everything to do with maternal pride. As the graduates came to a halt and stood at attention, Ellie noticed Admiral Hargrove moving to the side of the stage, his eyes scanning the audience. Commander Sullivan leaned in and said something to him, then pointed directly at her. For the first time in many years, Ellie felt the distinct sensation of being a target rather than an observer. Whatever was happening, it had nothing to do with the standard graduation ceremony. Someone had recognized her, and word was spreading among the senior officers. The base commander continued with his speech, but Ellie barely heard the words. She watched as Admiral Hargrove spoke into the ear of another officer, who then whispered to Commander Jackson. Jackson's head turned slightly toward the bleachers, his eyes finding her with visible surprise. "Are you all right?" Linda whispered beside her. "You look pale." "I'm fine," Ellie assured her, forcing a smile. "Just emotional seeing Jimmy up there." The truth was far more complicated. After decades of anonymity, of carefully maintained covers and redacted service records, Ellie suddenly found herself exposed. The very skills that had kept her alive during covert operations, the ability to read a room, to sense when attention was focusing on her, were now sending clear warning signals. They knew who she was, not just Jimmy's mother, not the vague naval administrator she claimed to be. They knew about Athena. As the ceremony proceeded, and the commander began calling graduates forward to receive their tridents, Ellie maintained her composed exterior while her mind raced through possibilities and contingencies. Old habits from a lifetime of intelligence work. What would this mean for Jimmy, for her carefully maintained privacy, for the classified operations that were supposed to remain buried in the past? She watched as one by one, the new SEALs received the golden trident pins that would mark them as members of this elite brotherhood. Each family cheered as their son, husband, or brother crossed the stage. When Lieutenant James Westbrook was called, Ellie rose with the others around her, applauding proudly as Jimmy strode across the stage. His face was serious until he spotted her in the crowd. Then, just for a moment, he broke protocol with a small smile meant only for his mother. Ellie felt tears threatening. This moment, watching her son achieve something he had worked so hard for, would have been emotional under any circumstances. But with the added complication of her past apparently emerging from the shadows, the pride was mixed with apprehension. As Jimmy returned to formation with his trident newly pinned to his uniform, Ellie noticed Commander Sullivan approaching the base commander and whispering something in his ear. The commander nodded, looking momentarily surprised before regaining his professional demeanor. Something was definitely happening, something unplanned. The graduates returned to their positions, standing at attention as the commander prepared to deliver his closing remarks. But instead of the expected speech, he paused, looking out over the audience with an expression of surprise and respect. Ladies and gentlemen, before we conclude today's ceremony, I've just been informed that we have a distinguished guest with us who deserves special recognition. Ellie felt her heart pounding as the commander continued. It's not often that we have the opportunity to acknowledge the contributions of those who served in programs so classified that their very existence was known to only a handful of individuals. Today, however, we have that rare privilege. Linda looked at Ellie in confusion, clearly wondering what this had to do with their section of the bleachers. Ellie kept her eyes forward, her expression carefully controlled despite the alarm bells ringing in her mind. What was happening? After 30 years of silence, why now? And why here at her son's graduation? The commander's next words confirmed her fears. Would Mrs. Alina Westbrook please stand and be recognized? For a moment, Ellie didn't move. Decades of operational security, of protecting her identity and the classified nature of her service, had conditioned her to avoid attention. Yet now, hundreds of eyes were turning toward her, searching the crowd. Mrs. Westbrook, the commander repeated, mother of Lieutenant James Westbrook. Slowly, Ellie rose to her feet. Beside her, Linda's mouth dropped open in confusion. Mrs. Westbrook served her country in ways that, until recently, remained highly classified, the commander continued. We are honored to have her with us today, not only as the mother of one of our graduates, but as a pioneer in special operations. A murmur swept through the crowd. On the field, Ellie could see Jimmy's face, a mixture of shock, pride, and concern. They had never discussed revealing her service history publicly. Indeed, even he knew only partial truths about his mother's military career. Admiral Hargrove now approached the microphone, his aged face solemn. Thank you, Commander. Mrs. Westbrook, or more accurately, Lieutenant Commander Alina Hayes Westbrook, served under my command in a program known by the code name Athena. For those unfamiliar with Greek mythology, Athena was the goddess of wisdom, courage, and strategic warfare. The crowd was completely silent now, all attention focused on either the Admiral or Ellie, who remained standing, her posture straight and dignified despite her internal turmoil. The Athena unit was established in 1988 as a highly classified special intelligence program, Hargrove continued. At a time when women were officially excluded from combat and special operations roles, 12 exceptional female intelligence officers were selected and trained to conduct operations that male operatives could not perform without detection. Ellie could feel Linda staring at her in astonishment. Around her, other families were whispering, trying to reconcile the unassuming woman in the blue dress with the Admiral's words. Lieutenant Commander Hayes, as she was known then, was one of the original 12 Athenas. Over her 24-year career, she conducted 37 classified operations in hostile territory, provided critical intelligence that saved countless American lives, and received commendations that, until recently, remained sealed in classified records. Ellie's mind raced back through those missions. Baghdad during the First Gulf War, where she had posed as a humanitarian worker while mapping Iraqi defensive positions. 3 weeks in Serbia gathering intelligence on war criminals. A harrowing extraction from North Korea after a mission went wrong. Memories she had carefully compartmentalized for years were suddenly surging forward. While I cannot detail specific operations, Admiral Hargrove continued, I can tell you that during Operation Desert Storm, intelligence provided by Lieutenant Commander Hayes directly contributed to the success of multiple special operations missions, including those conducted by the Navy SEALs. At this, Commander Sullivan stepped forward and whispered something to the Admiral, who nodded in agreement. In fact, Commander Sullivan, currently the commander of SEAL Team 4, was a young lieutenant during one of these operations. He has informed me that intelligence provided by Lieutenant Commander Hayes saved his entire team during a mission behind enemy lines in Iraq. Ellie met Sullivan's gaze across the distance. He offered a respectful nod, finally recognizing her as the intelligence officer who had briefed his team in that darkened room decades ago. 3 years ago, Hargrove continued, The Secretary of the Navy authorized the declassification of limited information about the Athena program, recognizing that these pioneering women helped pave the way for the integration of women into all combat roles, including special operations. Ellie had received notification of the partial declassification, but had never imagined it would lead to this kind of public acknowledgement. She had assumed her service would remain largely unknown, mentioned perhaps in historical records, but otherwise forgotten. Of the original 12 Athenas, only 8 survived their service years. Lieutenant Commander Hayes Westbrook was not only a survivor, but one of the most decorated members of the unit. Today, as her son receives his SEAL Trident, we have the opportunity to acknowledge her contributions as well. Admiral Hargrove turned to look directly at Ellie. Lieutenant Commander, on behalf of a grateful nation and a Navy that is only now beginning to understand the full extent of your service, thank you. The applause began slowly, then built into a thunderous ovation. On the field, Commander Jackson barked an order, and the graduating SEALs snapped to attention, facing her section of the bleachers. Jimmy stood rigidly, but his eyes shone with emotion as he faced his mother. Linda was still staring at Ellie, her expression shifting from shock to awe. "You were a spy," she whispered as the applause continued. "Intelligence officer," Ellie corrected quietly, uncomfortable with the attention but maintaining her composure. "There's a difference." "But you said you were in administration." "That was my cover," Ellie explained simply. "Even my children didn't know the full extent of my work until they were adults, and even then only parts of it." The base commander returned to the microphone as the applause finally subsided. "Mrs. Westbrook, would you please join us on the stage?" This was unexpected. Ellie hesitated, then made her way down from the bleachers. As she walked along the edge of the parade ground toward the stage, she passed the formation of new SEALs. Though they remained at attention, their eyes followed her. This unassuming woman suddenly revealed to be something entirely different from what they had assumed. Jimmy's eyes met hers as she passed. In them, she saw a new understanding. His mother was not just the supportive parent who had raised him after his father's death, but a pioneer who had served in shadows. His training had only begun to prepare him to understand. Admiral Hargrove met her at the steps to the stage, extending his hand to assist her, a courtesy rather than a necessity, as he well knew. "You look well, Elena," he said quietly, using her first name now that they were beyond the microphone's range. "I hope you'll forgive the surprise. When Sullivan recognized your name on the family roster, he contacted me immediately." "It's been 30 years, Admiral," Ellie replied, keeping her voice low. "I'm surprised anyone remembered." "Some missions are unforgettable," he said simply, "as are the people who made them possible." On stage, Commander Sullivan and the base commander were waiting. Ellie shook their hands, maintaining her composed exterior despite the strangeness of being in the spotlight after a lifetime of avoiding it. "Lieutenant Commander," the base commander addressed her, "we have something for you that is long overdue." He nodded to Commander Sullivan, who stepped forward holding a small wooden box. In 2022, the Secretary of the Navy authorized retroactive commendations for members of the Athena unit, Sullivan explained. "Most were presented privately, but when we realized you would be here today, Admiral Hargrove suggested we take the opportunity to present yours alongside your son's achievement." He opened the box, revealing a Navy Cross, the second highest decoration awarded for extraordinary heroism in combat. Ellie stared at it in disbelief. The Athenas had received various commendations during their service, but always in private, the medals locked away in classified personnel files rather than worn on uniforms. "This is for your actions during Operation Phantom Watch in February 1991, Admiral Hargrove explained quietly. "When your intelligence team was compromised behind enemy lines in southern Iraq, you stayed behind to ensure the rest of your team could escape. Despite being wounded, you completed the intelligence-gathering mission and transmitted critical data that directly saved the lives of 32 special operators, including Commander Sullivan's SEAL platoon." Ellie remembered that mission all too vividly: the unexpected enemy patrol, the desperate decision to split the team, the 9 days she had spent hiding in a bombed-out building, observing Iraqi troop movements while slowly bleeding from a shrapnel wound in her side. She had never expected recognition for it. At the time, the very existence of female operatives in the combat zone had been officially denied. "With your permission," Commander Sullivan said. "We would like to present this award now, in the presence of your son and these new SEALs who will benefit from the path you helped forge." Ellie hesitated. This was so far from the quiet ceremony she had expected today. Jimmy's graduation, a proud hug, perhaps dinner together afterward. Yet she could see in Sullivan's eyes that this meant something to him as well, a chance to acknowledge a debt long unpaid. "Very well," she agreed softly. The base commander returned to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor to present Lieutenant Commander Eleanor Hayes Westbrook with the Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism in combat during Operation Desert Storm." The citation reads, in part, "For extraordinary heroism while serving as senior intelligence officer during special operations behind enemy lines in Iraq." When her team was compromised, Lieutenant Hayes voluntarily remained in hostile territory to complete critical intelligence collection, despite suffering significant injuries. Her actions directly contributed to the success of multiple special operations missions and saved numerous American lives. Commander Sullivan stepped forward and pinned the Navy Cross to the collar of Ellie's blue dress. An unusual placement, but there were no precedents for presenting such a decoration to a retired officer in civilian clothes at a graduation ceremony. The audience erupted in applause again. On the field, the SEALs remained at attention, their respect evident in their rigid posture. "Lieutenant Commander," the base commander said, "would you like to say a few words?" Ellie had never sought public recognition, had never expected to address an audience about her classified service. Yet looking out at the crowd, at the families who had come to celebrate their loved one's achievements, at the young SEALs standing at attention, at her son whose face shone with pride, she felt a responsibility to speak. Stepping to the microphone, she gathered her thoughts. "Thank you for this unexpected honor," she began, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "When I arrived this morning, I came as a mother proud to watch her son graduate. I never anticipated standing here, having parts of my service record revealed." She paused, looking out at the assembled SEALs, her eyes finding Jimmy among them. The Athena unit operated in shadows by necessity. When we began our service, women were not permitted in combat roles, let alone special operations. We understood that our contributions would likely never be publicly acknowledged. That was part of our mission, to serve without recognition, to gather intelligence that others could act upon, to create paths that we ourselves might never walk openly. Ellie touched the Navy Cross now pinned to her dress. "This recognition belongs not just to me, but to all the Athenas, especially those who did not return from their missions. We served knowing that the work itself mattered more than acknowledgement. In that spirit, I accept this honor on behalf of all of us who did what needed to be done, regardless of whether anyone would ever know." She smiled slightly, looking directly at her son. "Today is supposed to be about these graduates, these exceptional young men who have endured one of the most demanding training programs in the world. So while I appreciate this moment, I would like to return the focus to them where it belongs. They are the future of special operations, building upon foundations that generations of service members, both acknowledged and unacknowledged, have established." Ellie stepped back from the microphone, nodding to the base commander to continue the ceremony. The audience applauded once more, but her words had achieved their purpose, redirecting attention to the graduates rather than herself. As she prepared to return to her seat, Admiral Hargrove touched her arm. "One more thing, if you'll permit it," he said quietly. Before she could ask what he meant, he nodded to Commander Jackson, who gave an order to the assembled SEALs. "Graduating class, present arms." As one, the 42 newly minted SEALs snapped to present arms, the highest form of military respect. Behind them, the instructors and other Navy personnel on the field did the same. On stage, Commander Sullivan and the other officers followed suit, rendering a formal salute to the woman in the blue dress with the Navy Cross on her collar. Ellie stood motionless, overwhelmed by this final gesture. After a lifetime of operating in shadows, of service without recognition, of putting mission before personal acknowledgement, here at last was something she had never sought but which touched her deeply, the respect of those who understood the true cost of service. Her eyes found Jimmy, his arm rigidly raised in salute, his face solemn with pride and new understanding. In that moment, mother and son connected across the distance. 2 generations of service, one hidden and one visible, both equally committed to something greater than themselves. Commander Jackson's voice rang out across the parade ground. "Order arms." The salutes ended in unison. Ellie nodded once, acknowledging their respect, then made her way back to her seat in the bleachers, where Linda and the other families were still staring at her in astonishment. As she sat down, Linda whispered, "All this time, I've been chatting about the weather with a war hero." Ellie smiled slightly. "I'm still the same person I was an hour ago." "No," Linda replied, shaking her head in wonder. "Now you're the person you always were, we just didn't know it." The ceremony concluded shortly thereafter, with the base commander offering final congratulations to the graduates. As the formal proceedings ended and families began making their way onto the field to congratulate their new SEALs, Ellie remained in her seat for a moment, gathering her thoughts. So much for coming to quietly watch Jimmy graduate. Her carefully maintained privacy had been pierced, her classified past partially revealed. Yet she couldn't deny feeling a certain weight lifting, the burden of secrecy lessened, if not entirely removed. She made her way down to the field, where Jimmy was waiting. Around them, other graduates were being embraced by excited families, but a small space had formed around her son, as if the crowd instinctively gave them room for their reunion. Jimmy stood tall in his uniform, the new trident gleaming on his chest. When he saw his mother approaching, his formal military bearing gave way to the smile of a son seeing his mom. He stepped forward and wrapped her in a tight hug. "Mom," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion, "why didn't you ever tell me about the Navy Cross?" "I didn't know about it myself until today," she replied truthfully. "These things weren't discussed, Jimmy. That was the nature of the work." He pulled back, looking at her with new eyes, still his mother, but now also a fellow service member whose experiences he was beginning to understand. "All those bedtime stories about the clever woman spy who outsmarted the bad guys," he said, shaking his head in wonder. "Those weren't just stories, were they? They were sanitized versions of your missions." Ellie smiled, some of them heavily edited for young ears. Before Jimmy could respond, they were approached by Commander Sullivan, now accompanied by several senior officers and a small group of older men in civilian clothes. "Lieutenant Westbrook, Lieutenant Commander Hayes," Sullivan said formally. "Some people would like to meet you both." As Ellie turned, she found herself facing three elderly men whose faces sent her back decades in time. Though aged now, she recognized them immediately, former SEALs who had been part of operations she had supported during Desert Storm. "Ma'am," said the first, extending his hand. "Chief Petty Officer Thomas Wilson, retired. You probably don't remember me, but I was part of the team that extracted from Target Delta in '91. The intelligence you provided saved our lives that night." "I remember, Chief Wilson," Ellie replied, shaking his hand. "You had a broken radio antenna. You signaled with your flashlight using a modified Morse pattern." Wilson's eyes widened in surprise. "That's right. How could you possibly remember that detail after all these years?" "Intelligence officers remember the critical details," she said simply. "Your team's extraction was anything but routine." The other former SEALs introduced themselves, each with similar stories, operations where Ellie's intelligence had made the difference between success and failure, between life and death. Jimmy stood beside her, listening with increasing amazement as he began to understand the true scope of his mother's service. "Your mom was a legend in certain circles," one of the retired SEALs told Jimmy. "We never knew her full name back then, just Lieutenant Hayes from Intelligence. But those of us who worked with her intel never forgot how accurate it was, how she somehow knew things that seemed impossible to know." "The Athena unit operated differently than traditional intelligence," Ellie explained, careful even now not to reveal classified methods. "We had unique approaches to gathering information." The gathered officers exchanged knowing looks. Even with partial declassification, much about the Athena unit remained classified, including their specialized training and unconventional tactics. "Well, whatever your methods," Commander Sullivan said, "they saved my men. I've waited 30 years to thank you properly, Lieutenant Commander." Ellie nodded her acknowledgement, still uncomfortable with the attention, but deeply moved by the recognition from those who understood the true value of what she and her fellow Athenas had accomplished. As the group dispersed, Jimmy gently touched the Navy Cross on his mother's collar. Mom, I don't even know what to say. All this time. All this time, I've been exactly who I've always been, Ellie finished for him. Your mother, who loves you very much and who is incredibly proud of what you've accomplished today. Jimmy smiled, then looked around at the crowded field, where families were taking photos with their new seals. This isn't how I expected today to go. I thought I'd be the center of attention, not competing with my secretly decorated spy mother. Ellie laughed, a genuine, carefree sound that few people ever heard from her. First, intelligence officer, not spy. Second, this is still your day. I'm just an unexpected footnote. Hardly a footnote, Mom. Jimmy's expression grew serious. You know what this means, right? All those years you served without recognition while Dad received medals and commendations publicly. It's finally being acknowledged. Ellie thought about Robert, who had known more about her service than most, but still not everything. He had understood her need for privacy, had respected the classified nature of her work. He would have been proud today, both of Jimmy's achievement and of the belated recognition of her service. Your father always understood that public recognition wasn't what mattered, she said softly. He knew the value of doing what's right, regardless of who sees it or acknowledges it. That's something I hope we've both passed on to you. Jimmy nodded thoughtfully. You have. He glanced at his new trident pin. I joined the SEALs because I wanted to make a difference, to serve in a way that had impact. I never realized I was following in your footsteps as much as Dad's. Different paths, same destination, Ellie replied. Service takes many forms, Jimmy. Around them, the graduation celebration continued, but there was a noticeable difference in how people approached them. Word had spread quickly about the unassuming mother who had turned out to be a decorated intelligence officer with a classified past. Some families kept their distance, unsure how to interact with this unexpected revelation. Others approached cautiously, offering respectful congratulations to both mother and son. Linda appeared through the crowd, her expression still showing traces of shock. Ellie, I mean Lieutenant Commander, I still can't believe it, she said. All morning I've been chattering about civilian things, probably boring you to tears while you were just being polite. Linda, you weren't boring me, Ellie assured her. And please, it's still just Ellie. The rank was a long time ago. But the Navy Cross, that's for heroism in combat. And all this time you just sat there letting me talk about my garden club and my son's girlfriend troubles. Jimmy laughed. That sounds like Mom. She's always been a better listener than talker. It comes with the territory, Ellie said with a small smile. In intelligence, listening is usually more valuable than speaking. As the crowd began to thin, Admiral Hargrove approached them one final time. Lieutenant Commander, I won't keep you from your celebration with your son, but I wanted to let you know that the other surviving Athenas have been notified about today's recognition. Matthews and Diaz send their regards. Ellie felt a surge of emotion at the mention of her former teammates. Corinne Matthews and Teresa Diaz had been part of her core team during some of their most dangerous missions. Thank you, Admiral. Please give them my best when you speak with them again. Hargrove nodded. The Secretary of the Navy is considering a more formal recognition ceremony for the entire Athena unit later this year. Something to properly acknowledge your collective contributions now that more of your operations have been declassified. Would you be willing to participate? Ellie hesitated. After decades of anonymity, the idea of public recognition still felt foreign, almost wrong. Yet she thought of the other Athenas, especially those who hadn't survived their missions. Perhaps they deserved to have their service acknowledged at last. I would need to think about it, she said honestly, but I appreciate the consideration. Of course, Hargrove understood her hesitation. Whatever you decide, know that your service has not been forgotten, even if it was hidden for many years. As the Admiral departed, Jimmy put his arm around his mother's shoulders. So, this isn't exactly the quiet graduation day we planned. No, Ellie agreed with a small laugh. Not quite. How about we get out of here? I know a quiet place on the beach where we can talk. I have a feeling there are a lot of stories you might finally be able to tell me now. Ellie looked up at her son. This young man who had just completed one of the most challenging military training programs in the world, who now wore the SEAL trident with pride, and who was looking at his mother with new understanding and respect. Some stories, she corrected gently. Some things are still classified. Jimmy grinned. Of course they are, some things never change. As they walked together across the parade ground, Ellie felt a sense of peace settling over her. She had come today expecting to be just another proud parent, invisible in the crowd, watching her son's achievement from a distance. Instead, the past she had kept carefully compartmentalized had emerged into the light, changing not only how others saw her, but perhaps, in some small way, how she saw herself. The Navy Cross pinned to her simple blue dress caught the afternoon sunlight. It was a symbol not just of one classified mission long ago, but of a lifetime of service that had remained in shadows until today. She had only come to watch her son graduate. She had never expected a SEAL team to stand at attention for her. Life, Ellie reflected, still had the capacity to surprise even the most experienced intelligence officer. The beachfront restaurant Jimmy had chosen offered a perfect view of the Pacific Ocean. Located far enough from the base to provide privacy, its weathered wooden deck extended over the sand, and the sound of waves provided a soothing backdrop to their conversation. They sat at a corner table, mother and son, both still processing the events of the graduation ceremony. "I requested a table away from other guests," Jimmy explained as a waiter poured water. "Figured we could use some privacy after this morning." Ellie smiled appreciatively. "Good tactical thinking, already putting your SEAL training to use." The waiter took their orders and departed, leaving them alone with the view and the weight of newly revealed history between them. "So," Jimmy began, leaning forward slightly, "now that some of it's declassified, tell me about the Athena unit, the real story, not the bedtime version." Ellie took a sip of water, considering how much she could share. The partial declassification opened some doors but left others firmly closed. "It began in 1988, she said finally. "The Cold War was winding down, but new threats were emerging. Terrorism, regional conflicts, non-state actors. Traditional intelligence gathering methods weren't always effective in these new environments." She looked out at the ocean, remembering. Admiral Hargrove was a captain then, with unconventional ideas about intelligence operations. He recognized that in certain regions, particularly in the Middle East and parts of Asia, women could access places and information that male operatives couldn't, not as combat soldiers, but as intelligence gatherers operating under deep cover. "How did they recruit you?" Jimmy asked. "I was already in naval intelligence, working primarily on signal analysis. One day, I was called to a meeting I thought was about a routine assignment. Instead, I found myself in a room with Admiral Hargrove and several other senior officers. They asked unusual questions about my language skills, my ability to work independently, my tolerance for isolation." Ellie smiled faintly at the memory. "I thought it was for an extended assignment at a listening post somewhere remote. 2 weeks later, I was at a classified facility in Virginia with 11 other women, beginning the most intense training program I've ever experienced." "Worse than Bud S?" Jimmy asked, referencing his own grueling training. "Different," Ellie replied carefully. "Bud S is designed to build combat operators who function as a team. Our training was more solitary. We needed to be self-sufficient, capable of operating alone in hostile territory for extended periods, often without support or extraction options." She didn't elaborate on the specifics. The sleep deprivation exercises that lasted twice as long as those in Bud S. The psychological isolation designed to test their mental resilience. The combat training conducted in secret because women weren't officially permitted in combat roles. "The 12 who completed training became the Athena unit," she continued. "We weren't a team in the traditional sense. We operated individually or in pairs, deployed wherever traditional intelligence assets couldn't go." Jimmy studied his mother's face. "And you did this for 24 years, all those times you were away on business or at a conference?" "Most of the time, those were legitimate covers," Ellie assured him. "By the time you and Sarah were born, I was in more supervisory roles, training the next generation of female operatives. The high-risk deployments were mostly in my earlier years." "Mostly," Jimmy noted, catching the qualification in her words. Ellie smiled slightly. Intelligence officers learn to be precise with language. The waiter returned with their meals, grilled fish for Ellie, steak for Jimmy. They ate in silence for a few moments, the weight of unspoken questions hanging between them. "That mission they mentioned, Operation Phantom Watch," Jimmy finally said. "The one that earned you the Navy Cross, what happened?" Ellie set down her fork, considering how to answer. Some details remained classified, but the core of the story had been revealed in the citation. "It was February 1991, during Desert Storm," she began quietly. "I was leading a small intelligence team, 2 other Athenas and a local asset, gathering information on Republican Guard movements near the Kuwait border. We were operating under non-official cover, posing as aid workers." She took a sip of water, memories flooding back with surprising clarity. "We discovered something unexpected, evidence of chemical weapons being moved to forward positions. This directly threatened coalition forces preparing for the ground offensive, including several special operations teams already behind enemy lines." Jimmy listened intently, seeing his mother in an entirely new light. "We needed to get this intelligence out immediately, but our scheduled extraction was still 3 days away. As we were preparing to move to an emergency communication point, a patrol stumbled upon our position." Ellie's voice remained steady, but her eyes reflected the tension of that long-ago night. "Our local asset was killed in the initial contact. We split up to evade capture. The plan was to regroup at an alternate location, but I was wounded by shrapnel during our escape." She unconsciously touched her side, where the scar remained hidden beneath her dress. "I knew I couldn't move quickly enough to make the rendezvous. If I tried, I would endanger the others. So I ordered them to proceed without me while I found a place to hide and continued gathering intelligence on the weapons' movements." Alone, behind enemy lines, while wounded, Jimmy's expression showed a mixture of horror and admiration. "It was the logical decision," Ellie said simply. "I found an abandoned building with a vantage point overlooking the main transportation route. For 9 days, I documented vehicle movements, force strength, and defensive positions. When I finally got to a position where I could transmit the data, special operations teams were already preparing missions based on incomplete intelligence." "Commander Sullivan's team," Jimmy realized. Ellie nodded. "His and several others. The intelligence I provided allowed them to adjust their approach, avoid the chemical weapons threat, and successfully complete their missions with minimal casualties." She didn't mention the details that remained classified. How she had cauterized her own wound using equipment from her emergency kit. How she had survived on minimal water and food while fighting infection. How she had twice narrowly avoided capture while changing observation positions. "How did you get out?" Jimmy asked. "That part is still classified," Ellie said with a small smile. "Let's just say it involved some creative problem-solving and help from unexpected quarters." Jimmy shook his head in amazement. "All these years, I thought Dad was the warrior in the family." "Your father was an exceptional soldier," Ellie said firmly. "His courage was never hidden, his sacrifices were acknowledged openly. That's the difference, Jimmy, not the service itself, but how it was recognized or not recognized." "Did Dad know about Athena, about what you really did?" Ellie's expression softened. "More than most, but not everything. That was part of our arrangement when we married. He knew I wasn't a standard intelligence officer. He knew my deployments sometimes took me into danger. But the specifics of missions, locations, methods, those remained classified even from him." She smiled at a memory. "He used to joke that between the 2 of us, we had enough security clearances to know everything except what was in Area 51. Jimmy laughed, then grew serious again. "It must have been hard, keeping so much of your life secret even from your family." "It was the hardest part," Ellie admitted. "Especially after you and Sarah were born. Compartmentalizing is an intelligence officer's skill, but it takes a toll when applied to your personal life." She reached across the table and took her son's hand. "But I never regretted my service, Jimmy, just as I know you won't regret yours, even when it requires sacrifices." Jimmy nodded, understanding in a way he hadn't before today. "So what happens now? Admiral Hargrove mentioned a formal recognition ceremony for the Athena unit. Will you participate?" Ellie looked out at the ocean, considering the question. "I'm not sure. For so long, anonymity was part of our operational security. Even now, with partial declassification, old habits are hard to break." "But you deserve the recognition," Jimmy insisted. "All of you do." "Perhaps," Ellie conceded, "but recognition was never why we served. We understood the terms when we joined Athena, that our contributions would remain in the shadows, that others would act on our intelligence and receive the visible honors." She touched the Navy cross still pinned to her dress. This is meaningful to me, not because it's a decoration, but because it represents the lives saved by that mission. The recognition matters less than the result. Jimmy considered this, recognizing the wisdom in her perspective. I think I understand. It's about the mission, not the credit. Exactly, Ellie smiled proudly. That's something every good intelligence officer and every good SEAL comes to understand. They finished their meal as the afternoon sun began its descent toward the horizon, casting golden light across the waves. Their conversation shifted to Jimmy's future, his upcoming assignment to a SEAL team, the additional training he would undergo, the career path he envisioned. As they waited for dessert, Jimmy's phone buzzed with a text message. He checked it and looked up with surprise. "It's from Commander Jackson," he said. "The guys from my class are gathering at the beach near the training center for an informal celebration. He says—" Jimmy paused, rereading the message to be sure. "He says they're requesting that both Lieutenant Westbrook and Lieutenant Commander Hayes Westbrook attend." Ellie raised an eyebrow. "Both of us. That's unusual for a graduation celebration." "Very," Jimmy agreed. "But after today, I don't think usual applies anymore." He studied his mother's expression. "We don't have to go if you're uncomfortable with the attention." Ellie considered for a moment. After decades of avoiding the spotlight, her instinct was still to decline. Yet something had shifted today. A door long closed had been partially opened, allowing her to acknowledge a part of herself she had kept hidden for so long. "Let's go," she decided. "They're your teammates now. Bonds formed in training like yours last a lifetime. You shouldn't miss this moment." An hour later, they arrived at the section of beach traditionally used for SEAL training. The sun was low on the horizon, painting the sky in dramatic shades of orange and purple. A group of about 30 men had gathered, the new graduates and several of their instructors, all now in casual clothes rather than uniforms. As Ellie and Jimmy approached, Commander Jackson stepped forward to greet them. Lieutenant Commander," he said formally, though he was now wearing shorts and a t-shirt. "Thank you for joining us. This is something of a tradition, an unofficial gathering after the formal ceremony." "I appreciate the invitation," Ellie said, "but I don't want to intrude on your celebration." "You're not intruding, ma'am," Jackson assured her. "After what we learned today, the men specifically asked if you would join us." He led them to where the graduates had gathered. Jimmy was immediately welcomed by his classmates, who surrounded him with the easy camaraderie of men who had endured extreme challenges together. Ellie hung back slightly, still uncomfortable being the center of attention. One of the graduates, a lieutenant named Ramirez, approached her. "Ma'am, we have something for you if you'll permit it." Puzzled, Ellie nodded. Ramirez signaled to another graduate who brought forward what appeared to be a shadow box, a wooden frame containing. Ellie caught her breath as she realized what it was. Inside the frame was a Navy SEAL trident pin, mounted alongside a small owl emblem that perfectly matched the one on her Athena Challenge coin. Below them was a simple inscription: "Predecessors in shadows, successors in light, with gratitude from SEAL Class 353. "We put this together after the ceremony," Ramirez explained. "Commander Sullivan provided the owl emblem. He said it was the symbol of your unit." Ellie stared at the shadow box, deeply moved by the unexpected gesture. I don't know what to say." "You don't need to say anything, ma'am," Ramirez replied. "We just wanted you to know that what you and the other Athenas did, it matters to us. You helped pave the way, even if nobody knew it until now." Commander Jackson stepped forward. "Lieutenant Commander, there's one more tradition we'd like to include you in if you're willing." He gestured toward the water, where the other graduates were beginning to gather at the shoreline. "The surf dedication," Jimmy explained to his mother. "After graduation, we go into the ocean one more time, not as students but as SEALs." "It's usually just for the graduates," Jackson added, "but given the circumstances, we thought it appropriate to invite you to join us at the water's edge." Ellie looked at the group of young men standing at the shoreline, her son among them, waiting expectantly. These were elite warriors at the beginning of their service, while she stood at the end of hers. Different paths, different eras, yet connected by a shared commitment to something larger than themselves. "I would be honored," she said quietly. As the sun touched the horizon, casting long shadows across the beach, Ellie walked with Jimmy to join the others at the water's edge. The graduates had formed a line facing the ocean, with a space left for Jimmy and to her surprise, a place for her as well. Commander Jackson stood before them, his back to the waves. "Gentlemen and Lieutenant Commander, this moment marks a transition. The water that tested you, that nearly broke you, that forged you into what you are now, awaits you one more time. But now you enter it not as students struggling to survive, but as warriors ready to serve." He looked at each face, ending with Ellie. "And today, we are honored to include someone who served in her own way. In shadows, we are only now beginning to understand. Lieutenant Commander Hayes Westbrook, you stand as a reminder that courage and service take many forms, some seen, some unseen, but all vital." Jackson turned to face the ocean. Enter the water as one team, bound by common purpose and uncommon valor. As one, the graduates moved forward into the surf. Jimmy offered his arm to his mother, who took it with a smile, slipping off her shoes as they walked together into the gentle waves. The cold water swirled around her ankles, then her calves as they waded deeper. Around them, the new SEALs were fully entering the water, some diving beneath the waves, others standing chest-deep in silent reflection. "How deep are we supposed to go?" Ellie asked her son with a touch of humor. "I'm not dressed for swimming." Jimmy laughed. "This is far enough. It's symbolic more than practical." They stood side by side in water up to their knees, watching the sun sink below the horizon. The Navy Cross, still pinned to Ellie's now dampened dress, caught the last rays of sunlight. "I never imagined standing here with you like this," Jimmy said quietly. "When I joined the Navy, when I decided to try for the SEALs, I thought I was choosing a completely different path than yours." "And now," Ellie asked, "now I see that we're not so different after all. Different methods, different eras, but the same core purpose." He looked down at his mother with profound respect. "I just hope I can serve with half the courage you did." Ellie felt her eyes filling with tears, a rare display of emotion she would have carefully controlled in her operational days. "You already have, Jimmy. Making it through Bud S requires exactly the kind of courage that matters most, the quiet perseverance that continues when no one is watching, when no recognition is promised." Around them, the other SEALs were beginning to make their way back to shore. The brief ceremony was concluding as darkness fell. "We should head back," Jimmy said, offering his arm again. As they turned toward the beach, Ellie noticed something unexpected. The graduates and instructors who had already reached shore were standing at attention, facing the water, facing her and Jimmy as they waded back. Commander Jackson's voice carried across the darkening beach. "Present arms." As one, the SEALs rendered a formal salute, not in the day's ceremonial setting, but here on this beach, in this moment of transition between light and darkness, between official recognition and personal respect. Jimmy released his mother's arm and returned the salute crisply, water still dripping from his clothes. Ellie stood straight beside her son, acknowledging the salute with the dignified nod of someone long accustomed to command respect, even if that respect had rarely been publicly displayed. "Order arms," Jackson called, and the salutes were lowered. As they reached the dry sand, one of the instructors stepped forward with a towel for Ellie. "You might need this, ma'am. The water's still cold this time of year." "I've been in colder," she replied with a small smile, accepting the towel. "But thank you." The gathering began to disperse, graduates making plans to continue their celebration elsewhere, instructors offering final words of advice and congratulations. Commander Jackson approached Ellie and Jimmy one last time. "Lieutenant Commander," he said, "it's been an honor to have you here today. I think you've given these new SEALs something valuable to reflect on as they begin their careers." "What's that, Commander?" Ellie asked. "That some of the most important service happens without fanfare or recognition. That courage isn't measured by decorations or public acclaim, but by doing what's necessary, regardless of who sees it." He looked at Jimmy. "That's a lesson every SEAL needs to understand, especially in an era when special operations receive more public attention than ever before." Jimmy nodded thoughtfully. "Yes, sir." As Jackson departed, Jimmy turned to his mother. "What now? Would you like to head back to your hotel? It's been a long day." Ellie looked at her son, this tall, strong young man in wet clothes with the confidence of his new status evident in his bearing. She thought about the day's unexpected revelations, the connections formed, the past honored in ways she never anticipated. "Actually," she said, "I think I'd like to stay a little longer. The night air feels good." They walked along the shoreline as darkness settled fully over the beach. Behind them, the graduate celebration continued around a small bonfire, their voices carrying faintly on the breeze. "Will you do it?" Jimmy asked after they had walked in comfortable silence for a while. "The formal recognition ceremony for the Athena unit that Admiral Hargrove mentioned." Ellie considered the question again, her perspective shifted by the day's events. "I think I will," she said finally. "Not for myself, but for the others, especially those who didn't survive to see any recognition at all. Their families deserve to know that their sacrifice is finally being acknowledged." She touched the Navy cross still pinned to her dress. "And perhaps it's time for me to step out of the shadows at least partially. Some stories deserve to be told, even if others must remain secret." Jimmy smiled. "I'm glad, and I'd be honored to attend if you'd like me there." "I would," Ellie replied warmly. "Very much." They turned to head back toward the parking area, the lights of Coronado visible in the distance. Behind them, the ocean continued its timeless rhythm, advancing and retreating, revealing and concealing, much like the dance of shadows and light that had defined Ellie's service. She had come today only to watch her son graduate, to be a proud mother in the audience, unnoticed and unremarkable. Instead, she had found herself unexpectedly honored, her long-hidden service finally acknowledged by those who understood its true value. And most meaningful of all, she had seen recognition and new understanding in the eyes of her son, a connection deeper than shared DNA, a mutual respect between two generations of service members who had chosen different paths to the same purpose. Alina Hayes Westbrook had never sought the spotlight. For 30 years, she had served in shadows, accepting anonymity as the price of her chosen role. Yet here at the end of this unexpected day, she found a certain peace in being seen at last, not by the general public who would never fully understand, but by those who mattered most. Her son, his fellow SEALs, and the remnants of the community she had served with such quiet dedication. She had only come to watch her son graduate. She never expected a SEAL team to stand at attention for her. But now that they had, she found herself grateful for the recognition, not for her sake, but for all the Athenas who had served alongside her, for the program that had opened doors that later generations of women would walk through openly, and for the reminder that service took many forms, all worthy of respect. As they reached the parking lot, Jimmy placed a gentle hand on his mother's shoulder. "You know what this means, don't you?" he asked with a hint of mischief in his voice. "What's that?" Ellie replied. "Family gatherings just got a lot more interesting. Wait until Sarah finds out her quiet, reserved mother was actually a covert intelligence operative with a Navy cross." Ellie laughed, a free, unburdened sound that seemed to release decades of carefully maintained reserve. "Well, some stories are worth waiting for." And as they drove away from the beach where one journey had ended and another had unexpectedly begun, Alina Hayes Westbrook, mother, intelligence officer, Athena, felt the weight of secrecy lifting from her shoulders like a tide finally returning to the sea.